Some wounds cut so deep that a man believes they'll never truly heal. For 3 long years, retired cowboy Hank Coulter has lived with crushing grief that follows him everywhere. After losing his only beloved son, Hank withdrew to his old weathered cabin, shutting out family, neighbors, and the world that once brought him joy. His quiet days change when a small, scruffy puppy appears on his porch. Night after night, the little dog returns, waiting patiently with gentle eyes. Hank tries to ignore his persistent visitor, but something about the pup's unwavering loyalty stirs buried memories. When curiosity wins and Hank follows the dog one morning, he discovers something that changes everything. What could this mysterious puppy possibly know about Hank's past that he doesn't? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana sky stretched endless and gray above the weathered cabin that Hank Coulter called home. Though home felt like too generous a word for what had become little more than a shelter from the world. The structure sat like a forgotten relic on the edge of Crow's Peak Valley, its cedar logs darkened by decades of mountain winters and summers that baked the wood until it creaked with memories. Hank stood at the kitchen window, his calloused hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold an hour ago. At 62, he still carried the lean frame of a man who'd spent his life on horseback, though these days his shoulders carried more than the weight of age. Through the glass, he watched the morning mist cling to the pine trees that bordered his property, a sight that once filled him with the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd found his place in the world. The cabin itself told the story of better times. Inhewn beams supported a roof that Hank and his son Dany had reshingled just 4 summers ago. Working side by side in the July heat, while Dany cracked jokes about his old man's stubborn insistence on doing things the hard way. The wraparound porch, where they'd spent countless evenings sharing stories and cold beer, now stood empty, its rocking chairs gathering dust and bird droppings. Inside, the living room remained frozen in time, as if Hank had simply stopped living the day everything changed. A framed photograph sat on the mantelpiece above the stone fireplace, turned face down against the wall. The weight of that single gesture spoke volumes about the man who couldn't bear to look at his son's smiling face, but couldn't bring himself to put the picture away either. Dany's image remained there, present but hidden, much like the love Hank carried but refused to acknowledge. The cabin's interior reflected a life interrupted. Mail piled unopened on the kitchen table, most of it from concerned family members whose attempts at connection had been met with silence. A thick layer of dust covered the television that Hank rarely bothered to turn on. The only sounds that regularly filled the space were the hiss of coffee brewing, the creak of old wood settling, and occasionally the low rumble of Hank's voice talking to himself, a habit that had developed in the absence of anyone else to speak to. Before the accident, before everything changed, Hank Coulter had been a different man entirely. For 35 years, he'd made his living on the rodeo circuit, earning a reputation as one of the most fearless bronc riders in the western states. His body bore the scars of that life, a crooked left wrist that ached before storms, a permanent hitch in his stride from a bull that had trampled his hip in Cheyenne, and countless smaller reminders of 8-second battles fought in dusty arenas across Montana, Wyoming, and the Dakotas. But it was after he hung up his spurs that Hank found his greatest joy. Dany had been born when Hank was 43, a late blessing that transformed the aging cowboy into something he'd never expected to be, a devoted father. Dany's mother, Maria, had been Hank's anchor during those transition years, helping him find purpose beyond the thrill of competition. When cancer took her just 6 years later, it was Dany who kept Hank grounded, who gave him a reason to build something lasting instead of chasing the next adrenaline rush. They'd worked this land together, father and son, turning the modest acreage into something resembling a functioning ranch. Dany had inherited his father's love for horses, but possessed a gentleness that Hank had never quite mastered. where Hank approached training with the methodical persistence of someone accustomed to being thrown and getting back up. Dany seemed to speak a language that horses understood instinctively. "You're always fighting them." "Dad," Dany had said during one of their last conversations. His 26-year-old wisdom delivered with the kind of casual authority that only sons can manage with their fathers. Sometimes you just have to let them know you trust them, and they'll trust you back. The irony of those words haunted Hank now, as he considered how completely he'd withdrawn trust from everyone and everything in his life. Dany had been preparing for his own future then, saving money to buy the Peterson place down the valley, talking about expanding their operation and maybe starting a family of his own someday. He'd been seeing a girl from town, Sarah's daughter Emma, and Hank had caught him more than once staring off into the distance with the kind of dreamy expression that meant a man was making plans. Those plans had died. On a wet Tuesday morning in October, when Dany's truck hit a patch of black ice on the mountain road, the details remained burned into Hank's memory with cruel clarity. The sheriff's knock on his door, the drive to the hospital, the doctor's gentle but final words in the sterile hallway. One moment, Hank had been looking forward to sharing morning coffee with his son. The next, he was signing papers and making arrangements for a funeral he couldn't quite believe was necessary. The months that followed had been a blur of concerned visitors, casseroles that went uneaten, and phone calls that went unanswered. His sister Sarah had driven up from Billings every weekend for the first year, bringing groceries and attempts at conversation that bounced off Hank's silence like rain off stone. His brother-in-law Tom had offered to help with the ranch work, only to be met with polite but firm refusal. Even the local pastor, a kind man named Father Mackenzie, who'd known Dany since childhood, had eventually stopped making the drive up to the cabin after months of one-sided conversations on the front porch. The truth was that Hank had discovered something terrible about grief. It could become a companion, as faithful and demanding as any living thing. It required daily attention, careful feeding, and absolute devotion. In return, it offered the bitter comfort of familiarity and the perverse satisfaction of suffering that felt proportional to loss. Healing, by contrast, seemed like a betrayal of Dany's memory, an admission that life could somehow continue normally after such a fundamental piece of it had been torn away. So Hank had constructed his days around absence. He woke each morning to coffee brewed for one, ate meals designed to sustain rather than satisfy, and fell asleep each night in a bed that felt too large and too quiet. He'd stopped checking the mail regularly, stopped answering the phone entirely, and had even disconnected the satellite dish after realizing that the voices and images from the outside world felt like intrusions from a place he no longer belonged. His daily routine had become a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. Morning coffee on the porch, but never in the rocking chair where Dany used to sit. Afternoon chores that kept his hands busy and his mind focused on immediate practical concerns. Evenings spent reading books he'd read before, safe stories with familiar endings that demanded nothing new from him emotionally. The isolation had become so complete that when the puppy first appeared 3 weeks ago, Hank's initial reaction had been annoyance rather than curiosity. He'd emerged from the cabin for his usual evening check of the property perimeter, a habit left over from his ranching days when coyotes and weather were constant concerns, to find a small, scruffy dog sitting at the bottom of his porch steps. The animal was clearly a stray, its golden coat matted and its ribs visible through thin fur, but its eyes were bright and alert, and it watched Hank with an intelligence that seemed almost human. When Hank had stomped his boot and made shooing gestures, the dog had simply wagged its tail once and settled more firmly onto its haunches, as if it had found exactly where it wanted to be. "Get on," Hank had said, his voice rough from disuse. "Nothing for you here." But the dog had stayed, patient and unmoving, until Hank had finally gone back inside and pretended it didn't exist. The next morning, the porch had been empty. and Hank had felt an unexpected flicker of something that might have been disappointment before he'd caught himself and dismissed the feeling as foolishness. Now, as he stood at his kitchen window with his cold coffee, Hank could see fresh paw prints in the dirt near his front steps. The dog had returned sometime during the night, claimed its spot on the porch, and apparently settled in to wait for him to acknowledge its presence. The persistence bothered him in a way he couldn't quite articulate, stirring something restless in his chest that felt dangerously close to hope. The puppy's persistence proved more unsettling than Hank had anticipated. Each evening for the next week, as shadows began stretching across the valley floor, the small dog would materialize on his porch like some kind of furry apparition. It never begged or whined, never scratched at the door, or made any demands beyond its simple, maddening presence. Hank tried ignoring it completely, stepping over the animal when he needed to fetch firewood or check his mailbox. The dog would shift just enough to let him pass, then resume its patient vigil. He tried, stomping and shouting, waving his arms like a scarecrow, but the puppy merely watched him with those calm, knowing eyes until Hank felt foolish and retreated back inside. "Stubborn mutt," he muttered on the fourth evening, peering through his curtains at the small form curled against his front door. "Nothing here for you but an old man who's got nothing left to give." But the dog remained, and with each passing day, Hank found himself looking forward to and dreading their evening encounters. There was something unsettling about the animal's unwavering faith that this was exactly where it belonged, a certainty that Hank envied, even as it irritated him. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when storm clouds had been gathering all day, promising the kind of late autumn downpour that could turn mountain roads into rivers and make the cabin feel even more isolated than usual. Hank had been watching the weather through his kitchen window, noting how the puppy seemed unperturbed by the approaching storm. When the first drops began to fall, against his better judgment, he found himself opening the front door. "Storm's coming," he said gruffly, addressing the dog for the first time. "Probably ought to find yourself some real shelter." The puppy looked up at him with what appeared to be gratitude, but made no move to leave its post. As the rain began in earnest, soaking the animal's already thin coat, something in Hank's chest tightened with unwanted sympathy. "Damn fool dog," he said. But he left the door open when he went back inside. An hour later, the puppy was still there, now thoroughly drenched and shivering, but maintaining its vigil with the kind of stubborn determination that reminded Hank uncomfortably of someone else he'd known. The someone who used to sit in that same spot when he was upset about something, waiting for his father to notice and ask what was wrong. The memory hit Hank like a physical blow, and he jerked away from the window as if the glass had burned him. Dany had done exactly that, claimed a spot on the porch steps whenever he needed to work up the courage for a difficult conversation. The night before he'd left for his first year of college, the evening he'd wanted to discuss dropping out to help full-time with the ranch, the morning he'd come to tell his father about the girl from town who'd caught his attention. "I need to think through what I want to say first," Dany had explained once. When Hank had asked why he always chose the cold, hard steps over the comfortable chairs just a few feet away. "The porch helps me remember what's important." The similarity was impossible to ignore, and it sent Hank stumbling backward into the living room with a violence that surprised him. His elbow caught the edge of a bookshelf, sending several items clattering to the floor. A coffee mug that shattered against the stone hearth, a stack of unread mail that scattered like leaves, and a small wooden box that hit the ground with a hollow thunk. The box broke open, spilling its contents across the hardwood floor. Hank stared down at the mess, his heart hammering against his ribs as he recognized items he'd hastily packed away in the days following the funeral. Dany's wallet, containing his driver's license and a picture of Emma from their first date. His class ring from the high school where he'd played quarterback. A small pocket knife that had belonged to Hank's own father, passed down through 3 generations of Coulter men, and there, resting against the base of the stone fireplace like an accusation, was the hand-carved wooden horse that Dany had made in shop class during his senior year. Hank dropped to his knees, without conscious thought, his hands trembling as he reached for the small figurine. The wood was smooth and warm, polished by years of handling, and Dany's initials were carved carefully into the base alongside the date he'd finished it. He'd been so proud of that horse, spending weeks perfecting the curve of its neck and the detail of its flowing mane. "It's for my son someday," Dany had said, setting it carefully on his bedroom shelf. "When I have a little boy, I want him to know his daddy could make things with his hands, not just break horses and fix fences." The simple hope in those words, the casual assumption of a future that would never come, broke something in Hank that had been holding firm for 3 years. A sound escaped him that was part sob, part growl, raw and wounded as the cry of an animal caught in a trap. He clutched the wooden horse against his chest and felt the careful walls he'd built around his grief crumble like old mortar. The tears came then, hot and bitter, carrying with them all the words he'd never said and all the moments they'd never share. He wept for the grandson who would never play with this carefully crafted toy, for the traditions that would die with him, for the simple, terrible fact that love didn't end just because life did. He was dimly aware of movement on the porch, the soft scratch of claws against wood, but he was too lost in his pain to care. The storm outside had intensified, rain lashing against the windows and wind moaning through the eaves like a chorus of lost souls. It seemed fitting that the weather should match his inner turmoil, that the world should acknowledge the magnitude of what had been lost. A cold nose touched his hand. Hank's eyes flew open to find the puppy sitting beside him, its wet fur plastered against its small frame. The animal had somehow gotten inside, through the door he'd left open, he realized, and had approached him with the same patient determination it had shown on the porch. There was no fear in its expression, despite Hank's emotional outburst, only a kind of gentle understanding that seemed impossible in something so young. "How did you—" Hank began, then stopped. His voice was hoarse from crying, and the question seemed less important than the fact that the dog was here, offering comfort he hadn't known he needed. The puppy pressed closer, its small body radiating warmth against Hank's side. It didn't try to lick his face or demand attention, simply provided its presence like a living anchor in the storm of his grief. For the first time in 3 years, Hank wasn't completely alone with his pain. He looked down at the wooden horse, still clutched in his hands, then at the dog, who had somehow chosen this exact moment to break through his defenses. The timing felt too perfect to be coincidence, too purposeful to be mere chance. But that was impossible, wasn't it? Dogs were smart, sure, but they couldn't understand the complex web of human emotion that had led to this breakdown. Could they? The puppy shifted slightly, settling more comfortably against his leg, and Hank found himself absently stroking its damp fur. The simple act of touching another living being after so long was both comforting and devastating. He'd forgotten how good it felt to be needed, even in such a small way. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something had fundamentally changed. The silence that had pressed against Hank's ears for months felt different now, less oppressive, more expectant, as if the world was waiting to see what he would do next. The puppy's breathing had evened out into the rhythm of sleep, trusting enough to rest against a stranger who had spent the last week trying to drive it away. That trust felt like both a gift and a responsibility, and for the first time since Dany's death, Hank found himself thinking about tomorrow instead of dwelling on yesterday. The morning after the storm brought crystalline air and a clarity that felt almost aggressive after the emotional upheaval of the previous night. Hank woke on the living room floor, his back protesting against the hardwood and his neck kinked at an uncomfortable angle. The puppy was gone, but a warm spot beside him and a few golden hairs on his flannel shirt provided evidence that the previous evening hadn't been some grief-induced hallucination. He found the wooden horse where he'd dropped it, nestled among the scattered contents of Dany's box. In the harsh light of morning, his breakdown felt embarrassing, like something that should be quickly forgotten and never acknowledged. But the horse remained solid and real in his hands. Dany's initials a reminder that some things were too important to ignore, no matter how much they hurt. The puppy was back on the porch by the time Hank made his coffee, sitting in its usual spot as if nothing had changed. But something had changed, and they both seemed to know it. When Hank stepped outside to retrieve his newspaper, a habit he'd maintained more from routine than interest, the dog's tail offered a single, restrained wag of acknowledgement. "You're still here," Hank observed. Keeping his voice neutral, the puppy tilted its head, as if considering whether this constituted an invitation for conversation. Hank studied the animal more carefully in the daylight. It was definitely a mixed breed, probably part golden retriever and part something smaller, with intelligent brown eyes and a coat that would be beautiful once it was properly fed and groomed. Despite its obvious hunger, it carried itself with dignity, never begging or approaching the food bowl Hank had reluctantly set out the night before. That food bowl, a ceramic dish that had once belonged to the barn cat who disappeared 2 winters ago, represented the first crack in Hank's determination to remain uninvolved. He told himself it was simple pragmatism. A hungry dog was more likely to get into his garbage or cause problems. Feeding it was just good sense, nothing more. But as the days passed, he found himself looking forward to the small ritual of filling the bowl each evening. The puppy would wait politely while he set out the food and fresh water, never rushing forward until Hank had stepped back and nodded his permission. There was something almost formal about the exchange, as if they were negotiating the terms of a careful treaty. The dog's presence also began stirring memories that Hank had been careful to avoid. Watching it explore the property with obvious familiarity reminded him of the hours he'd spent working alongside Dany, teaching him the practical skills that kept a ranch functioning. The tool shed where they'd repaired equipment together, the barn where Dany had learned to gentle horses, the fence line they'd walked every morning to check for damage or signs of predators. One afternoon, while hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, Hank's eyes fell on a pair of old leather work gloves draped over the fence post where they'd been forgotten 3 summers ago. Dany's gloves, worn soft from years of use and still carrying the faint scent of hay and horse leather that had been as much a part of his son as his laugh or his stubborn streak. The sight of those gloves hit Hank with unexpected force, not the sharp pain of fresh grief, but something deeper and more complex. They represented all the shared work and dreams that had died with Dany, the practical partnership that had made the ranch feel like more than just a place to live. Dany had always been planning ahead, thinking about improvements and expansions, talking about the day when they might buy more land or invest in better equipment. "We could build something real here, Dad," Dany had said during one of their fence-mending sessions, his young hands already more skilled than Hank's at splicing wire. "Something that lasts." The irony of those words wasn't lost on Hank now, as he stood in a yard that showed clear signs of neglect. Weeds growing through the gravel driveway, gutters that needed cleaning, a dozen small maintenance tasks that had once been shared burdens. The ranch was still here, still functional, but it felt hollow without the second pair of hands and the dreams that had driven them both forward. His brooding was interrupted by the arrival of his sister Sarah's truck, its familiar red paint and dented front bumper announcing her presence long before she reached the cabin. Hank suppressed a groan of irritation. He loved his sister, but her visits always carried an undertone of worry that made him feel like a patient being checked for signs of improvement. Sarah emerged from the truck with her usual purposeful stride, carrying a covered casserole dish and wearing the determined expression that meant she'd come prepared for battle. At 58, she was 4 years younger than Hank, but had appointed herself the family's chief warrior after their parents' deaths. Her graying hair was pulled back in its customary ponytail, and her work clothes suggested she'd driven straight from her job at the county extension office. "Hank," she said, her voice carefully casual, "thought I'd stop by and check on you." "I'm fine," he replied automatically, the response that had ended most of their conversations for the past 3 years. Sarah's eyes moved past him to the puppy, which had risen from its spot on the porch and was watching the interaction with obvious interest. Her expression shifted from concern to surprise, then to something that might have been cautious hope. "You got yourself a dog," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "It's not mine," Hank replied quickly. "Just a stray that's been hanging around." But even as he said it, the words felt hollow. The puppy had positioned itself slightly behind him, not hiding but clearly indicating its allegiance. Sarah noticed the placement and the food bowl beside the door, and her smile was gentle but knowing. "Well, whoever it belongs to, it looks like it's eating regular," she observed. "That's good. Animals need consistency." The pointed comment wasn't lost on Hank, but he chose to ignore it in favor of accepting the casserole and inviting Sarah inside for coffee. As they settled at his kitchen table, he became aware of how the cabin felt different with 3 living beings in it instead of just one. Less echoey somehow, more like a home. Their conversation meandered through safe topics: the weather, Sarah's work, local news that didn't require emotional investment. But Hank found himself distracted by the puppy's behavior outside. Through the window, he could see it walking purposefully across the yard, pausing at specific locations as if checking on things. The corner of the barn where Dany used to park his truck. The spot near the fence where they'd planned to build a new gate. The path that led to the old oak tree where Dany had carved his initials as a boy. The pattern was too deliberate to be random, too specific to be coincidence. It was as if the dog was conducting its own inspection of the property, following a route that seemed hauntingly familiar. The conversations began by accident. Hank hadn't intended to start talking to the puppy, but after 2 weeks of shared evening meals and quiet companionship, words began slipping out during their routine interactions. Small observations at first, comments about the weather or the day's minor events, but gradually expanding into something that resembled actual conversation. "Looks like we might get snow before the weekend," he found himself saying as he set down the food bowl one evening. The puppy listened with the grave attention of someone receiving important news, its head tilted at an angle that seemed to encourage further elaboration. "Been a mild fall, but that won't last. Never does in these mountains." The dog's patient attention was oddly comforting. Unlike human conversation, which required careful navigation of emotional landmines, talking to the puppy felt safe. There was no risk of saying too much or revealing weaknesses that might worry someone who cared about him. As the days shortened and evening came earlier, these one-sided conversations grew longer and more personal. Hank found himself describing his daily activities, sharing memories of ranch life, even voicing thoughts he hadn't dared speak aloud since Dany's death. The puppy never interrupted, never offered unwanted advice, simply listened with the kind of complete attention that had become rare in his human interactions. It was during one of these conversations that Hank's eyes fell on the worn cowboy hat hanging on a peg beside his front door. Dany's hat, the one he'd worn during their last conversation, still shaped by the curve of his son's head and marked with the salt stains of honest work. Hank had left it there out of habit, unable to move it, but equally unable to look at it without remembering. "Your boy ever wear a hat like that?" he asked the puppy, then immediately felt foolish for expecting an answer. But the dog's gaze followed his to the hat, and its expression seemed to grow more focused, more alert. The hat had been Dany's favorite, a gift from Hank on his 18th birthday, when his son had declared his intention to work the ranch full-time instead of going straight to college. It was a battered brown Stetson with a beaded hatband that Emma had made for him, and Dany had worn it with the pride of someone who understood that real work required proper equipment. The memory of their last conversation crystallized around that hat, bringing with it details that Hank usually worked hard to suppress. It had been early morning, October 15th, and Dany had been getting ready to drive into town for supplies. He'd been excited about something, practically bouncing with the kind of restless energy that meant he was planning something special. "I've got some errands to run," Dany had said, settling the hat on his head with practiced ease. "Should be back by noon." "We can work on that new fence line after lunch if the weather holds." But there had been something else in his expression, a kind of secret anticipation that Hank had noticed but hadn't questioned. Looking back, he wondered if Dany had been planning some kind of surprise, maybe involving Emma or the future they'd been building together. The not knowing was almost worse than the loss itself, all those unspoken plans and dreams that had died with him on that icy mountain road. The accident had happened just outside town, on a curve that was dangerous even in good weather. The sheriff had explained it all with careful professionalism, the sudden ice storm that had caught everyone off guard, the way Dany's truck had slid through the guardrail and rolled down the embankment. Death had been instantaneous, a small mercy that did nothing to ease the magnitude of the loss. He wouldn't have suffered, the sheriff had said, as if that made any difference to a father whose world had just collapsed. Hank became aware that the puppy had moved closer during his reminiscence, pressing against his leg with gentle insistence. When he looked down, he found the dog watching him with an expression that seemed to combine sympathy with something else. Expectation, perhaps, or encouragement. "You're a strange one," he murmured, scratching behind the animal's ears, "acting like you understand every word I'm saying." But as the days passed, Hank began to suspect that the puppy did understand more than seemed possible. Its behavior around the property had become increasingly purposeful, as if it was trying to show him something specific. It would walk to certain locations, the barn, the old oak tree, the spot where the driveway curved toward the main road, and look back at him expectantly, tail wagging in invitation. The pattern became impossible to ignore when Jake Morrison stopped by on a Saturday afternoon, ostensibly to check on the fence line that bordered their properties, but clearly motivated by the same concern that brought Sarah up from Billings. Jake was one of the few neighbors who hadn't given up on maintaining contact, though their interactions had been limited to practical matters and careful small talk. "Heard you got yourself some company," Jake said, nodding toward the puppy, which had taken up its usual position on the porch. "Just a stray," Hank replied. But without his usual defensiveness, Jake studied the dog with the practiced eye of someone who'd been around animals all his life. "Doesn't look like any stray I've seen. Too well behaved, too focused. Somebody trained that dog, and trained it well." As if responding to the compliment, the puppy stood and walked deliberately to the edge of the porch, then looked back at both men with obvious expectation. When neither moved to follow, it took several steps toward the barn, paused, and looked back again. "Now that's interesting," Jake observed. "It's trying to get you to follow it somewhere." Hank felt a flicker of the same uneasiness that had been growing stronger each day. The puppy's behavior was too intelligent, too purposeful to be mere animal instinct. But following it meant leaving the safety of his controlled environment, risking whatever emotions or memories might be stirred up by venturing beyond his carefully maintained boundaries. "Dogs know things sometimes," Jake continued, apparently oblivious to Hank's internal struggle. "Had a hound once that kept digging in the same spot behind my barn. Drove me crazy until I finally grabbed a shovel to see what had him so worked up. Turned out there was an old septic tank I didn't know about, and it was starting to cave in. That dog probably saved me from a nasty accident." The implication hung in the air between them, and Hank found himself looking at the puppy with new attention. The animal had settled back onto its haunches, but continued watching him with patient determination, as if it was willing to wait as long as necessary for him to make the right decision. After Jake left, Hank stood on his porch in the gathering dusk and considered his options. He could continue pretending the puppy was just a random stray seeking food and shelter, or he could acknowledge what his instincts were telling him, that this animal had appeared in his life for a specific reason, and that reason involved following it somewhere he might not be prepared to go. The decision came on a Tuesday morning when the puppy's patient waiting finally wore down Hank's resistance. For 3 days, the dog had been repeating the same routine, walking to the barn, looking back, taking a few more steps, then returning to the porch when Hank refused to follow. Its persistence reminded him uncomfortably of Dany's own stubborn determination when he'd set his mind on something important. "All right," Hank said finally, stepping off the porch with the feeling of crossing some invisible threshold. "Show me what's so important about that old barn." The puppy's response was immediate and enthusiastic, trotting ahead with obvious purpose while looking back frequently to ensure Hank was following. As they crossed the yard, Hank found himself studying the familiar landscape with new eyes, noticing details that had faded into background during his years of deliberate avoidance. The barn itself was a weathered structure that predated the cabin by at least 2 decades. Its red paint faded to the color of dried blood, and its roof patched with mismatched shingles. Hank had been avoiding the building since Dany's death, partly because it held too many memories, and partly because confronting the deterioration felt like admitting defeat. Now walking toward it with the puppy as his guide, he realized how much he'd let slide into disrepair. The heavy wooden doors stood slightly ajar, just as they'd been the morning Dany had worked inside them for the last time. Hank hesitated at the threshold, his hand on the weathered wood, memories threatening to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. Inside, he knew, was Dany's workshop area, the corner of the barn where his son had pursued various projects with the focused intensity that characterized everything he did. The puppy had no such hesitation, slipping through the gap between the doors and disappearing into the dim interior. After a moment, Hank heard a soft whine of encouragement, as if the dog was calling him to follow. Taking a deep breath, Hank pulled the door wide and stepped inside. The barn's interior was a museum of abandoned intentions. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light that slanted through high windows, and the air carried the familiar scent of hay, leather, and the faint sweetness of aging wood. But what caught Hank's attention immediately was the puppy's behavior. The animal moved through the space with obvious familiarity, walking directly to specific locations, as if following a map burned into memory. In the far corner, Dany's workshop area remained exactly as he'd left it 3 years ago. A workbench made from an old door and sawhorses held an array of hand tools, chisels, sandpaper, small clamps for delicate work. Several pieces of wood in various stages of completion sat along the bench's edge, projects that would never be finished. The sight of them hit Hank with unexpected force, physical reminders of dreams interrupted and potential unrealized. The puppy had positioned itself beside the workbench, its attention focused on something specific. Following the dog's gaze, Hank spotted what had captured its interest, a rusty harmonica sitting among the wood shavings and tools. He recognized it immediately as the instrument Dany had taught himself to play during his senior year of high school. Determined to learn something that might impress Emma during their courtship, for when we're sitting on the porch together, Dany had explained with the kind of romantic optimism that only young men possessed. Every girl likes a guy who can make music. The harmonica had been a constant companion during those months, accompanying Dany to the barn where he could practice without bothering anyone. He'd never become particularly skilled with it, but his enthusiasm had been infectious, and Hank had often found excuses to work nearby just to listen to his son's earnest efforts at creating melody. Now seeing it abandoned among the tools, Hank felt a sharp pang of recognition. This was where Dany had come that final morning, probably to work on whatever project had been occupying his attention in those last weeks. The secrecy that had characterized his son's behavior suddenly took on new significance. Dany had been building something, creating something that mattered enough to require privacy and planning. The puppy moved closer to the workbench, sniffing at specific areas with obvious purpose. When it reached the harmonica, it sat down and looked up at Hank with an expression that seemed to carry urgent meaning. The coincidence was too perfect to ignore. The dog's familiarity with the space, its knowledge of where things were located, its obvious connection to objects that had belonged to Dany. "You knew him, didn't you?" Hank said quietly, the words feeling both impossible and inevitable. "You belong to Dany." The puppy's tail wagged once, a restrained acknowledgement that somehow felt like confirmation. But how was that possible? Hank had never seen this dog before 3 weeks ago, and Dany had never mentioned wanting a pet. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The animal's behavior, its familiarity with the property, its apparent knowledge of places and things that mattered to Dany. Moving closer to the workbench, Hank began examining the projects Dany had left behind. Most were small items, decorative boxes, carved figures, a partially completed birdhouse. But beneath a canvas tarp, he discovered something larger and more ambitious, the frame for what appeared to be a rocking chair, its joints carefully fitted and its curved runners shaped with obvious care. The discovery sent a chill through him. Dany had been building furniture, creating something substantial and permanent. The kind of thing a man made when he was thinking about the future, about homes and families and the next generation. Had he been planning to propose to Emma? Had the chair been intended for their future home? Maybe even for the children they might have had together. The puppy had moved to another area of the workshop, its nose pressed against a loose board in the barn's wall. Its behavior was insistent, almost frantic, as if it was trying to communicate something urgent. When Hank approached, he could see that the board was slightly displaced, as if it had been moved recently and not properly replaced. "What is it, boy?" he asked, using the endearment for the first time. "What are you trying to show me?" The dog looked up at him with those intelligent brown eyes, then back at the loose board. Its message was clear. There was something behind that board, something important enough to merit this elaborate game of hide-and-seek that had been playing out over the past weeks. Hank knelt beside the puppy and worked his fingers around the edge of the board, feeling it give slightly under pressure. Whatever was hidden here, Dany had put it there deliberately, creating a secret cache in the place where he spent his private time. The thought that his son had kept secrets from him was both painful and intriguing. What could have been so important that it required such elaborate concealment? As he prepared to pull the board free, Hank found himself holding his breath. Whatever lay behind it would either answer the questions that had been plaguing him, or raise new ones that might be even more difficult to bear. But the puppy's patient presence beside him felt like encouragement, as if Dany himself was urging him forward into whatever truth awaited discovery. The board came free with surprising ease, revealing a small cavity that Dany had carved into the barn's framework. Inside, wrapped in an old piece of oilcloth, was a hand-drawn map of the property. But this wasn't just any map. It was meticulously detailed, showing features that most people would never notice. Marked with symbols and notations in Dany's careful handwriting, Hank spread the map on the workbench, his hands trembling slightly as he recognized the familiar contours of his land, rendered in precise pencil strokes. Dany had drawn everything: the cabin, the barn, the fence lines, even the old well that hadn't been used in decades. But what made the map extraordinary were the marks scattered across it, small X's at various locations, connected by dotted lines that formed a deliberate pattern across the property. The puppy had jumped up onto a nearby crate, positioning itself where it could see the map clearly. Its intense focus on the drawing seemed almost human in its concentration, as if it too was studying the carefully marked locations and remembering their significance. "What were you up to, son?" Hank whispered, tracing one of the dotted lines with his finger. The first X marked the barn where they currently stood. Another was positioned near the old oak tree where Dany had carved his initials as a boy. A third marked a spot near the creek that ran along the property's eastern boundary. There were 7 X's in total, each one connected to the others by those mysterious dotted lines, creating a path that wound across the entire ranch. As Hank studied the map more carefully, a disturbing realization began to take shape. The locations where the puppy had been trying to lead him, the spots it visited during its daily rounds of the property, corresponded exactly to the marked positions on Dany's map. It was as if the dog was following a specific route, checking on places that had been important to Dany for reasons that remained frustratingly unclear. The discovery sent Hank's mind racing back through the final weeks before the accident, searching for clues he might have missed. Dany had been unusually secretive during that time, often disappearing for hours without explanation and deflecting questions about his activities with vague references to projects and surprises. Hank had assumed his son was planning something romantic for Emma, maybe preparing to propose or working on some grand gesture that would require privacy to properly execute. But this map suggested something more complex, more deliberate than a simple romantic surprise. The care with which it had been drawn, the precise placement of each mark, the way it captured details that most people would overlook. All of it spoke to planning that went far beyond anything Hank had imagined his son was capable of. One memory surfaced with particular clarity. Dany coming back to the cabin late one evening, his boots muddy and his clothes dusted with pine needles. When Hank had asked where he'd been, Dany had smiled that secretive smile and said, "Just making sure everything's ready, Dad. You'll understand when the time comes." At the time, Hank had interpreted the comment as referring to Dany's relationship with Emma, maybe plans for their future together. But looking at the map now, he wondered if everything had referred to something much more elaborate, a project that involved the entire property and required careful coordination between multiple locations. The puppy had grown restless during Hank's reminiscence, pacing back and forth on its perch and occasionally whining softly. When Hank looked up from the map, he found the dog watching him with obvious impatience, as if it was frustrated by his slow progress in understanding what should have been obvious. "You know what all this means, don't you?" Hank said, addressing the dog directly. "You were part of whatever he was planning." The puppy's response was immediate and dramatic. It jumped down from the crate and trotted to the barn door, then returned to Hank and gently grasped his sleeve in its teeth, tugging insistently toward the exit. The message was unmistakable. The map was only the beginning, and the real answers lay somewhere else on the property. But following the map meant venturing into areas that Hank had been avoiding for 3 years, places that held too many memories and too much pain. The old oak tree, where he and Dany had shared countless conversations. The creek where they'd gone fishing on lazy summer afternoons. The hill overlooking the valley where Dany had talked about his dreams for the future. Each location represented a different kind of emotional minefield, and Hank found himself reluctant to start down a path that might lead to more pain than he was prepared to handle. The safety of the cabin, the controlled environment he'd created, suddenly seemed very appealing compared to the unknown territory that the map promised to reveal. The puppy seemed to sense his hesitation because it abandoned its gentle tugging and instead sat directly in front of him, fixing him with a stare that seemed to carry years of patient waiting. In that moment, Hank saw something in the dog's expression that reminded him powerfully of Dany, the same determined patience, the same quiet confidence that important things were worth waiting for. "He trained you for this, didn't he?" Hank said, the pieces finally beginning to fit together. "Somehow, he knew he might not be around to show me himself, so he taught you to do it instead." The idea was almost too fantastic to believe, yet it explained so much about the puppy's behavior. Its familiarity with the property, its knowledge of specific locations, its obvious intelligence and training, all of it pointed to careful preparation by someone who understood both the dog's capabilities and Hank's likely resistance to change. But how could Dany have known that his father would need this kind of guidance? What kind of 26-year-old planned for his own absence with such meticulous detail? The questions multiplied faster than Hank could process them, creating a tangle of confusion and wonder that left him feeling unmoored. The puppy had grown tired of waiting for a decision. It trotted back to Hank and began tugging more insistently at his sleeve, its patience clearly exhausted. There was something almost urgent in its behavior now, as if it understood that too much delay might result in losing momentum entirely. Looking down at the map one more time, Hank made his choice. Dany had gone to extraordinary lengths to create this elaborate treasure hunt, training a dog to guide his father through whatever revelation awaited at the end of the marked trail. The least he could do was trust his son's judgment and see where the journey led. "All right, boy," he said, folding the map carefully and tucking it into his shirt pocket. Let's go see what Dany wanted me to find. The puppy's tail wagged with obvious satisfaction, and it immediately headed for the barn door with renewed purpose. As they stepped back into the afternoon sunlight, Hank felt a mixture of anticipation and dread that reminded him of the moments before climbing onto a particularly challenging bronc, the knowledge that whatever happened next would test his limits in ways he couldn't fully prepare. For that the old oak tree stood at the highest point of Hank's property, its massive trunk scarred by decades of wind and weather, but still standing proud against the Montana sky. As they approached it, following the dotted line on Dany's map, Hank found himself remembering the countless hours he and his son had spent in its shade. It had been their thinking spot, the place they'd come to work through problems or simply enjoy the view of the valley spread out below. The puppy moved with increasing urgency as they drew closer to the tree, no longer pausing to ensure Hank was following. Its behavior had shifted from patient guidance to something approaching excitement, as if it recognized that they were finally approaching their true destination. When they reached the base of the massive oak, the dog immediately began circling the trunk, nose to the ground, searching for something specific. Hank pulled out the map to check their position, confirming that this was indeed one of the marked locations. The X was positioned precisely at the base of the tree, right where the initials HC plus DC were carved into the bark, a sentimental gesture from Dany's childhood that had marked this as their special place. But as Hank studied the carved letters, he noticed something he'd never seen before, a small arrow etched into the bark just below the initials, and pointing toward the ground. The puppy had found what it was looking for. It stood at a spot roughly 3 feet from the tree's base, pawing at the earth with focused determination. The ground here looked slightly different from the surrounding area, softer, as if it had been disturbed and carefully restored. Someone had been digging here, and recently enough that the signs were still visible to a trained eye. "What did you bury here, son?" Hank whispered, dropping to his knees beside the expectant dog. The earth gave way easily under his hands, confirming that it had been excavated before. About 18 inches down, his fingers encountered something hard and smooth, the edge of a waterproof container. Working carefully, Hank cleared the dirt away to reveal a large plastic storage box, the kind used by hunters to protect valuable gear from the elements. The puppy watched intently as Hank lifted the container from its earthen hiding place. It was heavier than expected, and he could hear items shifting inside as he set it on the ground. A piece of duct tape across the lid bore a message in Dany's familiar handwriting. "For Dad, when he's ready to remember that love doesn't end." Hank's hands trembled as he peeled away the tape and opened the lid. Inside, carefully wrapped in plastic bags and organized with typical Dany efficiency, was a collection of items that represented the most precious memories of their life together. Photographs from Dany's childhood, including several Hank had thought were lost. A recording device with a note attached, "Play this first." Letters bundled with ribbon, each one marked with a different date. And nestled in the center of it all, a small wooden box that Hank recognized as one of Dany's woodworking projects. The puppy had settled beside him, its attention focused on the recording device as if it knew what Hank would find when he pressed play. With shaking fingers, Hank activated the device and heard his son's voice emerge from the small speaker, clear and warm and impossibly alive. "Hi, Dad, if you're hearing this. It means Hope found you and brought you here like I trained her to do. Hope, that's what I named her, because that's what I want her to represent for you. Hope that even when people we love are gone, the love itself continues." The revelation hit Hank like a physical blow. Hope. The puppy had a name, an identity, a purpose that went far beyond coincidence or chance encounter. She had been specifically trained for this moment, prepared to guide him through grief he hadn't even known he was carrying. Dany's voice continued, gentle but determined. "I know you're probably wondering how I could have known to prepare all this. The truth is, Dad, I've been watching you struggle for a long time. Ever since Mom died, you've been pulling away from life, from joy, from the connections that make everything worthwhile. I've seen how you isolate yourself when you're hurting, how you convince yourself that staying alone is safer than risking more loss." Hank closed his eyes, overwhelmed by the accuracy of his son's observations. Even in life, Dany had possessed an emotional intelligence that surpassed his father's, an ability to see patterns and connections that others missed. "I started this project because I was worried about what would happen to you if something happened to me. I know that sounds dramatic, but ranch work is dangerous and life is unpredictable. I couldn't bear the thought of you disappearing completely into that cabin, cutting yourself off from everyone who loves you." The recording continued, and Hank found himself transported back to conversations he'd forgotten. Moments when Dany had tried to draw him out of his periodic withdrawals with gentle persistence and stubborn love. His son had been preparing for this possibility, not because he'd anticipated his own death, but because he'd understood his father's nature well enough to know that proper guidance might be necessary. "Hope took me almost 2 years to train properly. She's incredibly smart, Dad, smarter than any dog I've ever worked with. I taught her every inch of this property, showed her where all the important places are, made sure she'd be able to find everything I've hidden for you. She knows the route between all 7 locations, and she won't stop until she's shown you everything. 7 locations." Hank pulled out the map again, counting the marked spots and realizing that this was only the beginning. Hope had brought him to the time capsule first, but there were 6 more stops on whatever journey Dany had planned. The scope of his son's preparation was staggering, months or years of work, all designed to help his father navigate grief that Dany had somehow foreseen with heartbreaking accuracy. The letters in this box are for different occasions: birthdays, holidays, moments when you might need to remember that you're not alone. Read them when you feel ready, not before. Some of them might be hard to hear, but they're all written with love. Hank looked at the bundled letters, each one dated for future occasions that Dany would never see. The thoughtfulness of it overwhelmed him. His son had tried to extend his presence beyond death, to continue offering comfort and guidance when it would be needed most. "The wooden box contains something special, something I made for the grandson I might never have, but wanted you to have instead. Open it when you've seen all 7 locations. You'll understand why when the time comes." Hope had moved closer during the recording, pressing against Hank's leg with gentle insistence. Looking down at her, he saw not just a stray dog who'd wandered into his life, but the culmination of his son's love and foresight. Every patient evening on the porch, every knowing look, every moment of guidance, all of it had been intentional, part of an elaborate plan to help him heal. "I need you to know, Dad, that whatever happened to me wasn't your fault. You were the best father I could have asked for, and I never doubted for a second how much you loved me. But love doesn't mean we stop living when someone dies. It means we carry their memory forward and find ways to honor what they gave us." The recording was winding down, but Dany's voice remained strong and confident. "Hope will show you the rest when you're ready. Trust her, Dad. Trust the path I've laid out for you. And remember that ending this journey means beginning the rest of your life, the part where you let people love you again." The device clicked off, leaving Hank alone with hope and the weight of revelations that recontextualized everything he thought he knew about his son's final months. Dany hadn't been secretive because he was planning romantic surprises for Emma. He'd been secretive because he was preparing the most elaborate expression of love that Hank had ever encountered, a treasure hunt designed to guide him back to life, to connection, to hope. Hope nudged his hand gently, her message clear. They had 6 more locations to visit, 6 more pieces of Dany's plan to discover. The journey was just beginning, and his son's love would guide every step of the way over the next 3 days. Hope led Hank through the remaining 6 locations marked on Dany's map, each one revealing another carefully hidden cache of memories and messages. At the creek where they'd gone fishing, he found a waterproof pouch containing photographs of their best catches and a letter about the patience Dany had learned from those quiet hours by the water. Near the fence line they'd repaired together. Another container held tools that Dany had been saving for the projects they'd planned to tackle together, along with detailed instructions for improvements that would make the ranch more efficient. But it was at the fourth location, hidden in the hollow of an old pine tree, that Hank discovered the most revealing artifact of all, Dany's journal, a leather-bound book that chronicled his son's thoughts and observations during his final year of life. The worn cover and carefully filled pages spoke to regular use, and as Hank began reading, he realized he was gaining access to a side of Dany he'd never fully understood. The earliest entries dated back almost 18 months before the accident, beginning with casual observations about ranch life and gradually evolving into deeper reflections about family, legacy, and the complex relationship between fathers and sons. Dany's handwriting was neat and deliberate, each entry carefully considered rather than hastily scribbled. March 15th. Worked on the south fence with Dad today. He's been quieter than usual lately, and I can see him watching me sometimes with this expression I can't quite read. It's like he's trying to memorize something, or maybe he's worried about something he can't talk about. I wish he'd trust me enough to share what's bothering him. The observation stung with its accuracy. That had been during a particularly difficult period when Hank had been struggling with his own mortality, watching his son grow into full adulthood and wondering what would happen to the ranch, to their partnership, when age finally forced him to step aside. He'd never realized that Dany had been aware of his internal struggles, much less concerned about them, as Hank continued reading. Hope settled beside him in the afternoon shade, her presence a comforting constant as he navigated the emotional landscape of his son's private thoughts. The journal entries revealed a young man who possessed surprising wisdom about human nature and a deep understanding of his father's emotional patterns. April 2nd. Dad had another one of his withdrawal phases today. It always happens when something reminds him of Mom, or when he starts thinking too much about the past. He gets this look like he's carrying the weight of the world, and he stops talking about anything that matters. I tried to get him to come to town with me for Emma's birthday dinner, but he made excuses. Sometimes I think he's afraid that caring too much about present happiness means he's being disloyal to the people he's lost. The insight was devastating in its accuracy. Dany had understood Hank's relationship with grief better than Hank understood it himself, recognizing patterns that had become so ingrained they felt like natural responses rather than choices. The journal revealed a son who'd been carefully studying his father, not with judgment, but with the kind of loving concern that comes from wanting to help without knowing how. May 18th. Started working with Hope today. Found her at the animal shelter in Billings, and I swear she picked me as much as I picked her. The volunteers said she was incredibly smart, but too intense for most families. Perfect for what I have in mind. If something ever happens to me, Dad's gonna need someone who won't give up on him, someone who can be as stubborn as he is. Hank looked up from the journal to study Hope with new appreciation. She hadn't been a random stray at all, but a carefully chosen companion selected for specific qualities that Dany believed would match his father's temperament. The thought that his son had visited animal shelters, evaluating dogs based on their potential to provide emotional support, spoke to a level of planning that took Hank's breath away. The training entries that followed revealed the scope of Dany's undertaking. He'd worked with Hope for over a year, teaching her not just basic obedience, but complex tasks designed specifically for the grieving process. She'd been trained to recognize signs of depression and isolation, to provide comfort without being intrusive, and to guide people through predetermined routes when they were ready to accept help. June 30th. Hope mastered the property boundaries today. She can find every location I've marked, and she knows the order they should be visited. More importantly, she seems to understand the emotional significance of each spot. When we practiced at the oak tree, she got this look like she knew we were dealing with something sacred. The entries also revealed Dany's growing concern about his father's emotional state. Observations that had apparently motivated the elaborate support system he was constructing. References to Hank's increasing isolation, his tendency to avoid family gatherings, his reluctance to discuss anything related to future planning or personal happiness. August 12th, Dad turned down another invitation to Sarah's barbecue. I know he thinks he's protecting himself from more loss, but he's actually guaranteeing it. If you don't let people matter to you, you never have to risk losing them. But you also never get to experience the joy they could bring. I need to find a way to help him understand that love is worth the risk, even when, especially when, you've already lost people you cared about. As autumn progressed in the journal entries, Dany's observations became more urgent, his concern for his father's future more pronounced. The project with Hope had evolved from a contingency plan into something approaching necessity. As Dany recognized that his father's emotional withdrawal was becoming more severe rather than improving with time. September 25th. Emma asked me today why I'm spending so much time training. Hope for scenarios that might never happen. I couldn't explain it properly, but I have this feeling that Dad's going to need her someday. Not just for companionship, but for the specific kind of guidance she can provide. There's something about the way she responds to grief that's almost therapeutic. She doesn't try to fix it or make it go away. She just helps people carry it better. The final entries, written in the weeks before the accident, revealed a young man who was preparing for multiple futures simultaneously. Marriage to Emma, expansion of the ranch operation, and the possibility that his father might need extraordinary support to navigate life's inevitable challenges. The complexity of Dany's thinking during those final weeks was staggering. His ability to plan for contingencies that most people would never consider. October 10th. Finished the last cache today. 7 locations, 7 pieces of the puzzle that should help Dad remember who he was before grief convinced him that isolation was safer than connection. Each spot represents something we shared, something that mattered to both of us. If I'm not around to remind him of those things personally, maybe the places themselves can do it. The entry was dated just 5 days before the accident, suggesting that Dany had completed his preparations with an urgency that now seemed almost prophetic. Had he somehow sensed that time was running short, or had he simply reached a point where the project felt complete, ready to serve its purpose whenever it might be needed? October 12th. Hope and I did a final run-through of the entire route today. She knows every step, every location, every nuance of what needs to happen. More than that, she seems to understand the emotional weight of what we're preparing for. If something happens to me, I know she'll take care of Dad the way I would want to. She'll be patient with his stubbornness, gentle with his pain, and persistent enough to guide him back to the world of the living. The last entry was brief but profound. Love doesn't end when people die. It just changes form, becomes something we carry forward instead of something we share directly. Hope will help Dad understand that. She'll show him that receiving love, even from unexpected sources, doesn't diminish what we've lost. It honors it. As Hank closed the journal, Hope moved closer and rested her head against his knee. The simple gesture carried new meaning now that he understood her training, her purpose, her dedication to a mission that had been years in the making. She wasn't just a dog who'd wandered into his life. She was the living embodiment of his son's love, carefully prepared to provide exactly the kind of support he needed, but had been too proud or too scared to seek from human sources. The weight of Dany's foresight was overwhelming. His son had recognized patterns that Hank himself had been blind to, had prepared for emotional challenges that seemed insurmountable, and had done it all with a combination of love and practical wisdom that spoke to maturity far beyond his years. The elaborate treasure hunt, the carefully hidden caches, the months of training Hope, all of it represented the most sophisticated expression of paternal love that Hank had ever encountered. Except it was flowing in reverse, from son to father, for the first time since the accident. Hank found himself thinking about the future rather than dwelling on the past. Dany's plan had been designed not just to help him process grief, but to prepare him for whatever came next. The journal made it clear that his son had envisioned a father who would eventually emerge from isolation, reconnect with family and community, and find ways to honor their shared memories by living fully rather than merely surviving. The realization brought with it a sense of responsibility that was both daunting and energizing. Dany had invested months of work in preparing this gift, training Hope to deliver it at exactly the right moment and in exactly the right way. To ignore that investment, to retreat back into isolation after receiving such an extraordinary expression of love, would be the greatest possible betrayal of his son's memory. Hope seemed to sense the shift in his thinking because she stood and walked toward the path that led back to the cabin, then looked back at him with obvious expectation. There was one more location to visit, one final piece of Dany's plan to discover. But more than that, there were phone calls to make, relationships to rebuild, and a life to reclaim in honor of the son who had loved him enough to prepare for this exact moment. The final location marked on Dany's map was the most unexpected of all. Inside the cabin itself, specifically the bedroom that had once belonged to his son. Hank hadn't entered that room since the funeral, keeping the door closed and treating the space like a shrine too sacred to disturb. But Hope led him there with the same patient determination she'd shown throughout their journey. Sitting outside the door until he worked up the courage to turn the handle, Dany's room remained exactly as he'd left it that final morning. Bed made with military precision, clothes hung neatly in the closet, desk organized with the systematic care that had characterized everything about his son's approach to life. But following Hope's guidance, Hank found himself drawn to the dresser where a small wrapped package sat atop the surface, somehow overlooked during his cursory clearing of personal effects 3 years earlier. Inside the package was Dany's most prized possession, the silver rodeo belt buckle he'd won at his first competition, engraved with his name and the date of his victory. But attached to it was a note that transformed the meaning of the gift entirely. For my son someday, when he's old enough to understand that real courage isn't about staying on a bronc for 8 seconds. It's about getting back up every time life knocks you down and helping others do the same. Hank held the buckle in his trembling hands, remembering the pride that had shone in Dany's eyes when he'd won it at 17 years old. His son had talked about passing it down to the next generation, creating a tradition that would connect past and future through shared symbols of achievement and courage. Now it was being offered to Hank instead, as a reminder that the courage Dany had admired in his father could still be summoned when needed most. The note continued, "I know you're probably thinking this should go to my future son, but I realized something important while planning all this. You are my legacy, Dad. The way you taught me to approach life, the values you showed me through your actions, the love you gave me even when you thought you weren't good enough, that's what I want to pass forward. And you can't do that if you're hiding from the world." The weight of the buckle seemed to carry the weight of Dany's expectations. His faith that his father possessed reserves of strength that hadn't been tapped in 3 years of grief. It was both a gift and a challenge, an invitation to reclaim the man he'd been, before loss convinced him that isolation was safer than engagement. Hope had positioned herself on Dany's bed, watching Hank with an expression that seemed to combine patience with gentle insistence. The message was clear. The treasure hunt was complete, the revelations had been delivered, and now it was time to act on what he'd learned. Time to stop merely surviving and start living again. The phone call to Sarah required more courage than Hank had needed for any of the 8-second rides of his rodeo career. His sister answered on the second ring, her voice cautious when she recognized his number after months of silence. "Hank, is everything all right?" "I'm sorry," he said, the words tumbling out before he could rehearse them. "For the silence, for pushing you away, for making you worry. I found something that Dany left for me, and I understand now what I need to do." The pause that followed stretched long enough for Hank to wonder if the connection had failed. Then Sarah's voice returned, thick with emotion. "I've been waiting 3 years for this phone call. Tell me what you need." The conversation that followed was unlike any they'd shared since childhood, honest, painful, and ultimately healing. Hank found himself describing Dany's elaborate plan, Hope's patient guidance, and the revelations that had emerged from each carefully hidden cache. Sarah listened without interruption, occasionally asking gentle questions that helped him process the magnitude of what his son had prepared. "He knew you better than you knew yourself," Sarah said when he'd finished. "That boy always had more emotional intelligence than the rest of us combined. I remember him asking me once about your tendency to withdraw when you're hurting, wanting to understand how to help without making things worse." The image of Dany consulting with Sarah about his father's emotional patterns was both touching and slightly embarrassing. His son had apparently assembled a support network of concerned family members, all of whom had been watching Hank's gradual retreat from life with growing alarm. "There's a family barbecue next Sunday," Sarah continued carefully. "Emma will be there. She's been asking about you. So will Tom and the kids. Nothing fancy, just people who love you and miss having you around." The invitation hung in the air between them, representing everything Hank had been avoiding for 3 years. Crowds, conversations, the possibility of joy that might feel like betrayal of Dany's memory. But holding the silver buckle, feeling Hope's warm presence beside him, he found himself thinking about courage in new terms, not the kind that kept you on a bucking horse, but the kind that let you climb back into the arena after being thrown. "I'll be there," he said, and meant it. Hope's tail began wagging with such enthusiasm that her entire body vibrated with joy. It was as if she understood that the mission Dany had trained her for was finally reaching its successful conclusion. The patient months of waiting, the careful guidance through grief's labyrinth, the stubborn refusal to give up on a broken man, all of it had led to this moment of reconnection. For the first time in 3 years, Hank felt his face stretch into something that resembled a genuine smile. It felt rusty and uncertain, like a muscle that had forgotten its proper function, but it was real. Hope responded by launching herself into his arms, covering his face with enthusiastic kisses that spoke to pure, uncomplicated joy at his emotional breakthrough. The healing wasn't complete, would probably never be complete, but it had begun in earnest. And somewhere in the space between grief and hope, Hank could feel Dany's presence like a warm hand on his shoulder, proud of his father for finally accepting the gift that love could offer, even from beyond the grave. The wooden windchime had been Dany's final woodworking project, discovered in the small box from the time capsule, and accompanied by instructions written in his careful handwriting. "Hang this on the southwest corner of the porch, where it will catch the afternoon breeze. When you hear it singing, remember that joy and grief can share the same space in your heart." Hank stood on a stepladder in the fading light of evening, carefully positioning the chime according to Dany's specifications. The piece was beautiful in its simplicity. 7 hollow tubes of different lengths, carved from the same pine that grew throughout their property, and polished to a warm honey color. Each tube was precisely tuned to create harmonious notes when stirred by the wind, and Dany's initials were carved discreetly into the wooden cap that held them together. As Hank made the final adjustments to hang the chime securely, Hope sat on the porch below, her attention focused on his work with the intense concentration she'd shown throughout their journey together. Over the past week, since completing the treasure hunt, she had settled into life at the cabin with remarkable ease, as if she'd always belonged there. Her food and water bowls had found permanent homes beside the kitchen door, and she'd claimed Dany's old bed as her preferred sleeping spot, though she often migrated to Hank's room during the night when storms or nightmares made companionship necessary. The first gentle breeze that stirred the chime created a soft, melodious sound that seemed to perfectly match the peaceful quality of the approaching dusk. Hank climbed down from the ladder and stood beside Hope, both of them listening as the wind played the wooden tubes like a natural instrument. The sound was neither joyful nor sad, but something more complex, a musical acknowledgement that life contained multitudes, that beauty and sorrow could exist in the same moment without diminishing each other. He knew exactly what he was doing, didn't he, girl? Hank said softly, reaching down to scratch behind Hope's ears. Her response was a contented sigh that suggested complete agreement with the assessment. Over the days since Sarah's phone call, Hope had seemed more relaxed, less vigilant, as if the successful completion of her mission had allowed her to transition from working companion to family pet. But her intelligence remained obvious in small gestures, the way she seemed to anticipate Hank's needs, her instinct for providing comfort during difficult moments, her ability to encourage him toward choices that served his healing rather than his fear. The next morning brought a decision that Hank had been avoiding for 3 years. Looking at the calendar on his kitchen wall, he realized that the approaching weekend marked the anniversary of Dany's death. For the past 2 years, he'd spent that day in deliberate isolation, drinking too much coffee and reliving memories that brought only pain. But holding Dany's belt buckle and hearing the gentle music of the windchime, he found himself thinking about a different way to mark the occasion. Hope seemed to understand his intention when he headed for his truck, jumping into the passenger seat with the confidence of someone who belonged there. The drive to Crow's Peak Cemetery took 20 minutes, along winding mountain roads that Hank had traveled countless times but had avoided since the funeral. The familiar landscape looked different now, not necessarily better or worse, but somehow more present, more real than it had seemed during his years of deliberate disconnection. Dany's grave was located on a hillside that offered a view of the valley where they'd lived and worked together. The headstone was simple granite with his name, dates, and a brief inscription that Sarah had chosen: beloved son, faithful friend, keeper of hope. Wildflowers had been planted around the marker. Emma's work, Hank realized, evidence that others had been maintaining connections he'd been too afraid to acknowledge. Hope settled beside the headstone with natural dignity, as if she understood the sacred nature of the space. Hank knelt in the grass, running his fingers over the carved letters of his son's name and feeling the odd combination of presence and absence that defined grief. Dany was gone. That fact remained unchanged and unchangeable. But the love between them, the lessons learned, the hope carefully planted for future growth, all of that remained vibrantly alive. I found everything you left for me, Hank said aloud, his voice carrying across the quiet cemetery. The letters, the recordings, hope, all of it. I understand now what you were trying to tell me. The wind stirred through the pine trees that bordered the cemetery, creating a sound remarkably similar to the wooden chime now hanging on his porch. In that whisper of moving air, Hank could almost hear Dany's voice responding with the gentle patience that had characterized his approach to his father's stubborn moments. I know you worried about me withdrawing from life, Hank continued. You were right to worry. After your mother died, I convinced myself that loving people completely just meant losing them more completely when they were gone. But you showed me something different through hope, through all those carefully planned revelations. Love doesn't make loss worse, it makes it bearable. The conversation continued as the sun moved across the sky, Hank sharing 3 years of accumulated thoughts and feelings that had been trapped in silence. He talked about the loneliness, the fear, the gradual recognition that isolation was just another form of dying. He described Sarah's barbecue the previous weekend, his tentative steps toward rejoining the world, the strange comfort of Hope's patient companionship. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across the hillside, Hank felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with ending and everything to do with continuation. The grief would always be part of him. He understood that now, but it no longer had to define the boundaries of his existence. Dany's love had found a way to transcend death, not by eliminating pain, but by showing him how to carry it without being crushed by its weight. Thank you, he said finally, his hand resting on the warm granite of the headstone. For everything. for the life we shared, for the lessons you taught me, and for loving me enough to plan for my healing, even when you couldn't be here to see it happen." Hope rose and pressed against his leg. Her warm presence, a reminder that some gifts continue giving long after their giver has departed. Together, they walked back to the truck and began the drive home, where the wind chime would greet them with its gentle music, and the evening routine of shared companionship would continue the healing that Dany's love had made possible. 6 months had passed since Hope first appeared on Hank's porch, and the transformation was evident in details both large and small. The cabin that had once stood as a monument to isolation now showed signs of life renewed: fresh paint on the shutters, a repaired front gate, and flower boxes that Emma had helped plant during one of her regular visits. The wind chime Dany had crafted sang softly in the afternoon breeze, its music a constant reminder that beauty could emerge from carefully tended wood, just as healing could emerge from carefully tended grief. Hank knelt on the porch, adjusting the new collar around Hope's neck. The leather was soft and well-crafted, with her name engraved in simple letters that caught the sunlight. "Hope," he read aloud, running his finger over the careful engraving. "Suits you perfectly, doesn't it, girl?" Hope's tail wagged with satisfaction, though whether from the compliment or the comfortable fit of her new collar was impossible to determine. Over the months since completing Dany's treasure hunt, she had evolved from patient guide to beloved companion, her presence a source of comfort that extended far beyond Hank's own healing journey. The sound of approaching vehicles interrupted the peaceful moment, and Hank looked up to see the familiar caravan that had become a regular feature of his weekends. Sarah's red truck led the procession, followed by Tom's SUV loaded with camping gear and Emma's compact car bringing up the rear. The sight of them filled Hank with an emotion he'd almost forgotten: anticipation for the company of people who mattered to him. "Looks like our guests are here," he told Hope, who had already begun her welcoming dance of excitement. The family gatherings had started as tentative affairs, brief visits designed to test the waters of Hank's renewed openness to connection. But they'd evolved into something richer and more meaningful, genuine celebrations of the bonds that had survived years of neglect and emerged stronger for having been tested. Sarah brought her famous potato salad and an endless supply of stories from her work at the county extension office. Tom contributed his skill with the barbecue grill and his talent for organizing games that included everyone from teenagers to grandparents. Emma arrived with photo albums and a gentle way of keeping Dany's memory alive through shared stories that emphasized joy rather than loss. But today's gathering was different, marked by the presence of newcomers who had heard about Hank's story through the quiet networks that connect people dealing with similar struggles. Margaret Peterson, a widow from town whose husband had died the previous winter, had asked Sarah if she might visit the man who'd found healing with the help of a specially trained dog. Behind her came Jim Morrison, Jake's older brother, whose adult son had been killed in Afghanistan 2 years earlier, and who'd been struggling with grief that seemed insurmountable. The introductions were gentle and careful, mediated by Hope's natural ability to ease social tensions and create connections between people who might otherwise struggle to find common ground. She moved between the new visitors with the same patient attention she'd once shown Hank, seeming to recognize their emotional needs and respond accordingly. "Dany trained her to help people like us," Hank explained to Margaret as Hope settled beside her chair, offering the kind of undemanding presence that grieving people often needed most. "He understood something about healing that took me 3 years to figure out. Sometimes the best medicine is just knowing you're not alone." The afternoon unfolded with the easy rhythm that had become characteristic of these gatherings. Conversation flowed naturally between practical topics and deeper reflections, punctuated by laughter that would have seemed impossible during Hank's years of isolation. Hope moved through the group like a four-legged therapist, providing comfort where it was needed and encouraging interactions that might not have happened otherwise. As evening approached and the visitors began departing, Hank found himself standing on the same porch where his journey with hope had begun. The view remained unchanged, the rolling hills of Montana stretching toward distant mountains, the pine trees marking the boundaries of his property, the familiar landmarks that had shaped his life for over 20 years. But everything else had been transformed by the simple act of choosing connection over isolation. Hope over despair, Emma was the last to leave, pausing at her car to thank Hank for sharing Dany's story with the newcomers. "He would be so proud of what you're doing," she said, her eyes bright with tears that spoke to joy rather than sorrow, carrying his love forward by helping other people heal. After the visitors had gone, Hank and Hope resumed their evening routine on the porch, but with a difference that reflected how much had changed. Instead of the hollow silence that had once pressed against his ears, the air was filled with the gentle music of the windchime and the distant sounds of life continuing in the valley below. The isolation that had once felt necessary now seemed like a choice he'd made from fear rather than wisdom. Hope settled beside his chair with a contented sigh, her mission completed, but her purpose ongoing. She had guided him back to the world of the living, shown him that love could survive death by transforming into service to others, and proven that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. The collar around her neck bore her name as both identification and aspiration, Hope embodied in the form of a patient dog who understood that sometimes the most profound healing happens one gentle step at a time. Some wounds cut so deep that they never fully disappear. But Hank had learned that healing didn't require the absence of pain. It required the presence of love, strong enough to carry grief without being crushed by it. Hope persistent enough to survive the darkest valleys, and connections meaningful enough to make the journey worthwhile. As the stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Hank reached down to stroke Hope's golden fur and whispered the words that had become his evening prayer. "Thank you, Dany, for the love that doesn't end, for the hope that keeps growing, and for teaching me that sometimes the most beautiful gift we can give someone is showing them how to heal." The wind chime sang softly in response, and Hope's gentle breathing provided the rhythm for a peace that had been 3 years in the making, but would last the rest of their lives together.